You think you know the story of Moses, don't you? The great prophet who parted the Red Sea, received the 10 Commandments, and led the Israelites out of Egypt? Well, prepare yourself, because what I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you believed about one of history's most revered figures. Hidden deep within ancient texts, buried beneath centuries of religious interpretation, lies a story so controversial that religious scholars have deliberately kept it from the public eye for thousands of years. This isn't just another biblical retelling. This is the untold account of Moses' most humiliating defeat, orchestrated by an African deity whose power was so immense that it left the great prophet trembling in fear, questioning everything he thought he knew about divine authority. The religious establishment has spent millennia covering up this encounter because it threatens the very foundation of Judeo-Christian theology. What you're about to discover happened during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Those mysterious decades that the Bible glosses over with suspicious brevity. While the scriptures paint this period as a time of divine guidance and gradual spiritual growth, the reality was far more chaotic, filled with divine confrontations that would make your blood run cold. Picture this: Moses, now in his 70s, weathered by decades of leading a rebellious nation through the harshest desert conditions imaginable. His face, still bearing the lingering glow from his encounters with Yahweh on Mount Sinai, had begun to dim. The people were growing restless, questioning his authority, and even Aaron and Miriam had challenged his leadership. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. It began with a series of dreams that haunted Moses night after night. In these visions, a towering figure with skin as dark as midnight and eyes that burned like twin suns appeared before him, speaking in a language that predated Hebrew, Aramaic, and even the ancient Egyptian tongue. This being claimed dominion over the very land through which the Israelites wandered, declaring that Moses had trespassed into sacred territory without permission. The dreams became more vivid, more terrifying with each passing night. The mysterious deity, who would later reveal himself by a name so powerful that Moses dared not speak it aloud, began to demonstrate his authority over the elements in ways that dwarfed even the plagues of Egypt. Rivers appeared in the desert where none had existed, only to vanish when the Israelites approached. Mountains shifted their positions overnight, making familiar landmarks disappear. The very stars seemed to rearrange themselves in the heavens, creating constellations that spelled out warnings in ancient African script. Moses tried to dismiss these occurrences as tests from Yahweh, but deep in his heart, he knew something far more complex was at work. The other tribal leaders began to notice the changes in their prophet. He would spend hours staring at the horizon, muttering prayers in languages they didn't recognize, his hands trembling as he held the staff that had once commanded such respect from Pharaoh himself. Then came the morning that changed everything forever. Moses awoke to find his tent surrounded by a circle of perfectly carved obsidian stones, each one inscribed with symbols that seemed to move and shift when looked at directly. In the center of this circle stood a figure that defied all description, neither fully human nor purely divine, but something that bridged both realms with terrifying majesty. Moses, son of Amram, the being spoke, its voice carrying the weight of millennia. "You have entered my domain without acknowledgement, led your people across sacred grounds without offering proper respect, and claimed divine mandate in lands where your God holds no authority." The prophet tried to respond, to assert his God-given mission, but found his voice caught in his throat. The staff that had turned into a serpent before Pharaoh, that had struck the rock to bring forth water, that had been raised to part the Red Sea itself, this sacred instrument of divine power began to writhe in his grasp, transforming not into a serpent, but into something far more ancient and primordial. What happened next would haunt Moses for the remainder of his days, an encounter so profound that it would reshape his understanding of divine hierarchy and cosmic order. The African deity didn't just challenge Moses, he systematically demonstrated that there were powers in this world that existed long before Yahweh chose the Hebrew people, forces that commanded respect and recognition. But here's where the story takes its most shocking turn: the revelation that religious authorities have spent centuries trying to suppress. The being who confronted Moses wasn't just any ordinary deity. Historical evidence suggests this was Apedimак, the lion-headed war god of Nubia, whose influence extended far beyond what modern archaeologists have acknowledged. Ancient Kushite texts, recently discovered but kept from public view, describe encounters between their gods and Hebrew prophets that paint a very different picture of the Exodus narrative. As Moses stood paralyzed before this manifestation of ancient African divine power, something unprecedented occurred that would forever alter the trajectory of Hebrew history. The ground beneath his feet began to crack and split, not from divine wrath, but as a sign of the earth itself, recognizing an authority that predated the covenant at Sinai. What transpired in those next crucial moments would explain so many mysteries that have puzzled biblical scholars for centuries. Why Moses struck the rock in anger, why he was denied entry to the Promised Land, why certain books were removed from the biblical canon, and most importantly, why there are 40 years of wandering that remain largely undocumented in official religious texts, but the most devastating revelation was yet to come. This African deity didn't just possess power equal to Yahweh. Historical evidence suggests something far more controversial, something that would shake the very foundations of monotheistic belief. What Moses discovered about the true hierarchy of divine powers would change everything. The humiliation that followed wasn't just personal, it revealed a cosmic truth that religious leaders have spent millennia trying to hide. But what exactly did this ancient African god reveal to Moses? That was so dangerous. The confrontation that unfolded next would become the most carefully guarded secret in religious history. As Moses stood frozen before Apedimák, the ancient Nubian war god, something happened that contradicted everything the Hebrew prophet thought he knew about divine supremacy. The being before him didn't just claim equal authority to Yahweh. He began to demonstrate knowledge of conversations, promises, and divine plans that should have been known only to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "Your confusion amuses me, Moses," Apedimák spoke, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the very air shimmer. "Did you truly believe that the divine realm operates under the same exclusive arrangements that mortals create? Yahweh and I have been colleagues for far longer than your people have existed." The implications of these words hit Moses like a physical blow. Everything he had built his identity upon, his role as the chosen prophet, his exclusive relationship with the Almighty, his understanding of divine hierarchy began to crumble. But what came next would prove even more devastating to his worldview. Apedimák raised his hand, and suddenly the desert around them transformed into a vision of the cosmic realm. Moses found himself witnessing scenes that no human was meant to see. Meetings between divine beings that predated creation itself, councils where decisions about mortal affairs were debated and decided not by one supreme deity, but by a pantheon of ancient powers working in mysterious harmony and occasional conflict. "Behold," Apedimák commanded, "the truth your people are not ready to comprehend." In this divine vision, Moses saw Yahweh himself, but not as the solitary, all-powerful creator he had always known. Instead, he witnessed his God engaged in what appeared to be negotiations with other divine entities, including the very being who now stood before him. They were discussing territories, spheres of influence, and the movements of human populations as if mortals were pieces on some incomprehensibly vast cosmic board. The most shocking revelation came when Moses observed a scene that appeared to be set in the recent past. He watched as Yahweh consulted with Apedimach about the route the Israelites should take through the wilderness. The African deity wasn't just aware of the Exodus, he had been instrumental in planning it. The 40 years of wandering weren't punishment or preparation. They were a carefully orchestrated journey through territories that required permission from multiple divine authorities. "Every step your people have taken," Apedimach explained as the vision faded. "Every miracle you have performed, every commandment you have received, all of it required consultation with the ancient powers of this continent. Did you think your Red Sea crossing happened without the approval of Sobek, the crocodile god who rules those waters? Did you imagine that your journey through our sacred lands occurred without negotiation?" Moses tried to speak, to defend his understanding, but found himself speechless. The staff in his hand, that symbol of divine authority, suddenly felt heavy and foreign. Worse yet, it began to respond to Apedimach's presence in ways that terrified the prophet. The sacred object started to glow with a different energy, one that felt ancient beyond measure, as if recognizing a power it had known long before it came into Moses' possession. "Your staff," Apedimach observed, with what might have been amusement, "carries within it wood from trees that grew in my domain. Did you never wonder why it possessed such power? The serpent it becomes is not just any snake, it is the sacred cobra of Wadjet, an Egyptian goddess who granted your people protection during their escape. Every miracle you have performed has drawn upon energies that flow through networks of divine cooperation your people cannot fathom." The revelation struck Moses with the force of divine lightning. Everything he had attributed to Yahweh's exclusive power had actually involved a complex web of divine collaboration. His God hadn't been working alone. He had been part of an ancient system of divine governance that spanned continents and millennia, but the humiliation was far from over. Apedimach gestured toward the Israelite camp, visible in the distance, and Moses gasped at what he saw. Shimmering above the tents were barely visible forms, other divine entities keeping watch over different sections of his people. Egyptian gods protecting those who had intermarried, Canaanite deities overseeing trade relationships, and dozens of local spirits maintaining the delicate balance that kept 40,000 people alive in harsh wilderness conditions. "Your people survive not because your God provides exclusively for them," Apedimach explained, "but because every step of this journey requires cooperation between dozens of divine authorities. The manna that falls each morning, it requires the blessing of harvest deities from 3 different pantheons. The water that flows from rocks, it comes from underground rivers protected by earth spirits who must grant permission for each miracle." Moses felt his knees weaken. His entire ministry, his identity as the unique prophet of the one true God, was crumbling before his eyes. But Apedimach wasn't finished with his revelations. The African deity approached Moses and placed a hand that burned like heated bronze upon the prophet's shoulder. Instantly, Moses was flooded with visions of the future, images of how this encounter would be erased from official religious records, how scribes would carefully edit out references to divine cooperation, how the complex truth would be simplified into a narrative of exclusive divine relationship that mortal minds could more easily comprehend. "Your people are not ready for cosmic truth," Apedimach said, with something resembling compassion. "They need the security of believing in one supreme protector. But you, Moses, you must carry the burden of knowing that divine reality is far more complex than your theology suggests." The visions continued, showing Moses events yet to come, how future religious leaders would deliberately suppress evidence of divine cooperation, how archaeological discoveries would be hidden or reinterpreted, how the very encounter he was experiencing would become a forbidden secret, passed down only through the most trusted mystical traditions. But why? Moses finally found his voice. Why reveal this to me? Why show me truths that will only torment me? Epidemac's expression grew serious, his ancient eyes reflecting wisdom accumulated over millennia. Because a great test approaches, one that will require you to make impossible choices. Your people will face a crisis that cannot be resolved through the simple faith they now possess. You will need to draw upon truths that transcend your current understanding, even if doing so means confronting the limitations of everything you have taught them. The African god gestured toward the horizon, where storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed. The test begins now, Moses, and the first trial will require you to humble yourself before powers your people have been taught to fear. As if summoned by his words, figures began emerging from the desert. Other divine beings, each representing different aspects of the cosmic forces that had been silently influencing the Hebrew journey. Moses recognized some from Egyptian mythology, others from Canaanite traditions he had tried to suppress, and several that belonged to spiritual systems completely unknown to him. Choose, Epidemac commanded, his voice now carrying the weight of inevitable destiny. Will you cling to the simplified truth that comforts your people, or will you embrace the complex reality that might save them? The decision Moses faced would determine not just his own fate, but the future of Hebrew religion itself. And what he chose in that moment would explain so many mysteries that scholars still debate today. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. What Epidemac showed Moses next would explain the real reason he was denied entry to the Promised Land, and why certain divine powers required a sacrifice that would change the course of history forever. The gathering of divine beings around Moses created a supernatural council unlike anything recorded in human history. As each entity materialized from the desert winds, the prophet realized he was witnessing something that predated not just Hebrew religion, but the very concept of organized worship itself. These weren't mere gods from different pantheons. They were the original architects of cosmic order, beings who had shaped reality long before humans had developed the capacity to worship anything at all. Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, appeared with his ibis head gleaming in the supernatural light that now bathed the desert. Beside him manifested Moloch, the Canaanite deity whose worship Moses had forbidden among his people, yet who now stood as an equal among these ancient powers. Baal, Asherah, Chemosh, and dozens of other entities that Hebrew scripture had condemned, as false idols took their places in the expanding circle, each carrying an authority that made the air itself tremble with recognition. You begin to understand, Epidemac observed, noting Moses' growing horror. Every deity your people have been taught to reject, every power your laws have declared abominable, they are all part of the same cosmic hierarchy that includes your Yahweh. The divine realm does not operate according to human concepts of religious exclusivity, but it was the next arrival that shattered Moses' remaining composure entirely. From the eastern horizon approached a figure that radiated such familiar divine energy that Moses dropped to his knees instinctively. Yet as the being drew closer, the prophet realized with dawning terror that while the power signature was unmistakably that of Yahweh, the appearance was completely different from any manifestation he had ever witnessed. This version of his God bore characteristics that seemed to incorporate elements from all the surrounding deities. Egyptian symbolism adorned divine robes, Canaanite sacred geometry pulsed within the divine aura, and Nubian royal regalia crowned the Godhead in ways that made Moses question whether he had ever truly seen his deity's complete form. My faithful servant, This composite manifestation of Yahweh spoke, but the voice carried harmonics that included every divine language Moses had ever heard. You have served the aspects of me that your people could comprehend, but now you must confront the totality of what I am. The revelation that followed would explain every inconsistency in Hebrew scripture that scholars had debated for millennia. Yahweh began to reveal that what Moses had experienced as a single exclusive deity was actually a collaborative consciousness that included aspects of every divine power that had ever influenced human civilization. The jealous, wrathful God of the Hebrew people was just one facet of a cosmic entity too complex for mortal minds to grasp in its entirety. The commandment against worshipping other gods, Yahweh explained, was never about denying their existence or authority. It was about teaching your people to focus their devotion through a single channel until they developed the spiritual maturity to comprehend divine complexity. But that time of simplicity is ending, Moses. The challenges ahead require access to the full spectrum of divine power. Pedamac gestured toward the Israelite camp, where Moses could now see that supernatural crises were already beginning to manifest. Plagues were emerging that didn't respond to the limited divine interventions Moses had previously been authorized to perform. Enemy armies were approaching with spiritual protections that Hebrew prayers couldn't penetrate. Natural disasters loomed that would require negotiations with elemental forces Moses had never been trained to address. Your people face annihilation, Thoth declared, his ancient wisdom cutting through Moses' confusion like a blade. Not from human enemies or natural catastrophes, but from cosmic forces that your limited theological framework cannot comprehend or counter. The simplified faith you have taught them is insufficient for the challenges ahead. The gathering of divine beings began to explain the true nature of the crisis. The Israelites had unknowingly violated ancient territorial agreements between various divine powers during their wilderness wandering. Their rejection of local spiritual protocols had created magical imbalances that were now threatening to tear apart the very fabric of reality in the region. Unless these cosmic debts were addressed through proper divine channels, the entire Hebrew nation would face destruction from forces beyond mortal comprehension. "But this is impossible," Moses protested. "You commanded me to teach them to worship, only you to reject all other divine claims. How can the very obedience you demanded now be the source of their destruction?" The answer that came would haunt Moses for his remaining days. Yahweh, speaking now in the voice that incorporated all divine consciousness, revealed that the Hebrew nation had been designed as a spiritual experiment from the beginning. Their monotheistic faith was intended to serve as a testing ground for whether mortal beings could eventually evolve beyond the need for multiple divine relationships and access cosmic power through a single divine channel. The experiment has yielded valuable data, Yahweh continued with cosmic detachment that chilled Moses to his core. But it has also created unintended consequences. Your people's spiritual isolation has made them vulnerable to forces they cannot recognize or defend against. The choice now is whether to maintain the purity of the experiment and allow them to face destruction, or to compromise their theological framework in order to save them. Pedamac stepped forward, his massive presence radiating both compassion and inexorable authority. "The solution requires a sacrifice, Moses. Not of animals or grain, but of everything you have built your identity upon. To save your people, you must publicly acknowledge the authority of the divine powers they have been taught to reject. You must lead them in worship rituals that will honor the cosmic territories they have violated. You must become, in the eyes of your own people, an apostate and heretic." The weight of this choice crushed down upon Moses like the collapse of mountains. To save his people's lives, he would have to destroy their faith. To preserve them physically, he would have to shatter their spiritual foundation. Everything he had taught them about divine exclusivity would be revealed as theological preparation rather than ultimate truth. "And if I refuse?" Moses asked, though he already knew the answer. The gathered divine beings gestured toward visions of the future that began materializing in the desert air. Moses saw his people consumed by spiritual forces they couldn't understand, their covenant with Yahweh proving insufficient to protect them from cosmic powers they had never learned to appease. He watched the Hebrew nation disappear from history entirely, their experiment in monotheistic faith ending in complete annihilation. "The irony," Moloch observed with ancient sadness, "is that your people could have been protected all along if they had been taught to recognize divine complexity rather than divine exclusivity. Their faith could have been a bridge to cosmic understanding rather than a wall against it. But the cruelest revelation was yet to come. As Moses grappled with this impossible choice, Yahweh revealed the final devastating truth. This crisis had been anticipated from the beginning. The 40 years of wilderness wandering hadn't been punishment or preparation. They had been a deliberate delay, allowing cosmic forces to build to the breaking point where this choice would become inevitable. "Your entire ministry, Yahweh, explained with terrifying gentleness, has been leading to this moment. Every miracle, every commandment, every revelation has been preparing both you and your people for the day when simple faith would prove insufficient and complex spiritual truth would become necessary for survival." Moses realized he had been manipulated by forces beyond his comprehension, used as an instrument in a cosmic plan that required him to eventually betray everything he had been taught to value. The divine beings around him weren't his enemies. They were his colleagues in a spiritual operation so vast and complex that human language had no terms adequate to describe it. As the supernatural council awaited his decision, Moses understood that whatever choice he made would destroy him. If he maintained theological purity, his people would die and his life's work would end in failure. If he embraced cosmic complexity to save them, he would be remembered as the prophet who led Israel into apostasy. The decision he was about to make would explain everything that happened next. But Moses had no idea that his choice would trigger events that would reshape not just Hebrew history, but the entire cosmic balance of power. What he decided in that moment would determine whether humanity was ready for divine truth or needed to remain protected by theological simplicity for centuries to come. Topic 04. The sacrifice that rewrote history, the silence that followed. Moses' contemplation seemed to stretch across eternity itself. The gathered divine beings waited with patience born of cosmic timescales, while the prophet of the Hebrews wrestled with a choice that would determine the fate of not just his people, but the entire trajectory of human spiritual evolution. In that suspended moment, Moses understood that he stood at the crossroads of history, where the decision of one man would ripple through millennia of human consciousness. Finally, with tears streaming down his weathered face, Moses raised his eyes to meet the collective gaze of the divine council. "I choose my people," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of absolute surrender. "I will do whatever is required to save them, even if it means destroying everything I have taught them to believe." The reaction was immediate and earth-shattering. The desert around them exploded into supernatural activity as cosmic forces that had been held in delicate balance suddenly shifted into new configurations. Lightning that burned with colors beyond human perception split the sky, while the ground beneath their feet began to resonate with frequencies that spoke directly to the soul rather than the ears. Epidemic nodded with something resembling both satisfaction and sorrow. "Then let the great working begin, Moses. But understand that what we are about to undertake will require more than theological compromise. It will demand the complete reconstruction of your identity and the temporary, Suspension of everything your people think they know about divine reality. What followed was unlike anything recorded in human spiritual experience. The gathered deities began a ritual that predated civilization itself, one designed to merge multiple streams of divine consciousness into a single, overwhelming manifestation that could address the cosmic crisis threatening the Hebrew nation. Moses found himself at the center of this supernatural working, his human consciousness being expanded to accommodate divine perspectives that no mortal mind was designed to contain. The process was excruciating, as each deity contributed their essence to the collective working. Moses experienced their complete divine history, every worship ritual ever performed in their honor, every prayer ever offered, every sacrifice ever made. He lived through thousands of years of human spiritual experience in compressed moments that stretched his sanity to its absolute limits. Through Thoth's consciousness, he experienced the development of written language and sacred mathematics. Through Moloch's awareness, he felt the desperate love of parents willing to sacrifice everything for their children's survival. Through Baal's essence, he understood the primal forces of fertility and abundance that made human civilization possible. Each divine perspective added layers of complexity to his understanding that transformed his conception of reality entirely. But the most devastating integration came when his expanded consciousness merged with aspects of Yahweh he had never been allowed to access. Moses discovered that his God's jealousy and wrath weren't emotional responses, but necessary cosmic functions designed to maintain spiritual balance in a universe where divine powers required careful regulation to prevent reality itself from becoming unstable. You begin to see Yahweh's true voice spoke directly into Moses' transformed consciousness, why we could not reveal this complexity from the beginning. Human minds require gradual preparation for cosmic truth, or they shatter entirely under the weight of infinite perspective. The ritual reached its crescendo as Moses found himself temporarily elevated to a level of divine consciousness that allowed him to perceive the true scope of the crisis his people faced. The Hebrew rejection of local spiritual protocols hadn't just offended other deities. It had created tears in the fabric of reality itself. Cosmic energies were bleeding through these spiritual wounds, manifesting as plagues, natural disasters, and supernatural predators that conventional Hebrew faith had no power to address. With his expanded awareness, Moses could see the solutions, but implementing them would require him to perform actions that would brand him as an apostate in the eyes of every Hebrew tradition. He would need to build altars to foreign gods, lead his people in worship ceremonies that violated every commandment he had given them, and publicly acknowledge divine authorities that Hebrew law declared abominable. The cosmic debt must be paid. Ebedemac explained as the ritual concluded, and Moses felt his consciousness contracting back toward human limitations. But the payment cannot come from ignorance. Your people must understand, at least partially, what they are doing and why it is necessary. What happened next would explain the most mysterious passages in Hebrew scripture, the cryptic references to divine encounters that scribes had struggled to interpret for centuries. Moses returned to the Hebrew camp carrying divine authority that transcended anything he had previously possessed, but also bearing the terrible burden of truths that would destroy his people's faith if revealed too directly. The first test came immediately. As Moses approached the camp, he found it in chaos. A plague unlike anything they had experienced during their Egyptian captivity was consuming the people, not a disease of the body, but a supernatural affliction that attacked the soul itself. Hebrew prayers and sacrifices proved completely ineffective against this cosmic malady. Moses knew exactly what was required. The plague was a manifestation of spiritual imbalance caused by their violation of ancient territorial agreements. 2. Stop it. He would need to perform a ritual that honored the local divine powers they had offended. But doing so would require him to publicly compromise every theological principle he had spent decades establishing. Standing before his people as they writhed in supernatural agony, Moses made the choice that would haunt him forever. He began to build an altar incorporating symbols from multiple divine traditions, invoking names of powers that Hebrew law declared forbidden, and leading his people in worship practices that their own scriptures condemned as abominable. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Many of the Hebrews were horrified, believing their prophet had either gone insane or been possessed by evil spirits. Others, desperate for relief from the supernatural plague, participated reluctantly in rituals they didn't understand. A few, those with the deepest spiritual sensitivity, began to grasp that they were witnessing something far more complex than simple apostasy. Aaron confronted Moses privately that night, his face reflecting both confusion and terror. "Brother, what have you done? How can we worship other gods after everything Yahweh has commanded us?" Moses' response would be carefully edited out of official religious records, but fragments survived in mystical traditions that passed the truth down through secret channels. "These are not other gods, Aaron. They are aspects of the same cosmic reality we have always served, revealed now because our survival depends upon understanding divine complexity rather than divine simplicity." The theological implications were staggering. Moses was essentially revealing that monotheism, as the Hebrews had understood it, was a preparatory teaching rather than ultimate truth. The divine reality was infinitely more complex than their current spiritual framework could accommodate, and their crisis required them to evolve beyond their theological comfort zone or face complete destruction. But the price for this revelation was devastating. As word of Moses' apostasy spread through the camp, the unity that had sustained the Hebrew people through 40 years of wilderness wandering began to fracture. Some declared him a false prophet, others defended him as still divinely inspired, and a few began to understand that they were witnessing the birth of a completely new form of spiritual consciousness. The supernatural plague ended, but the spiritual crisis it precipitated had only begun. Moses found himself leading a people who no longer knew what to believe about their own identity, their divine relationships, or their ultimate destiny. The simple faith that had sustained them through the Exodus had been shattered by the complexity of cosmic truth, and this was only the beginning of the transformations that Moses' impossible choice would unleash. The consequences of Moses' decision would ripple through history in ways that would reshape human spirituality forever. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. The real reason why Moses was forbidden from entering the Promised Land, and how his cosmic compromise would determine the future of divine-human relationships for millennia. The aftermath of Moses' cosmic compromise created a spiritual catastrophe that would echo through Hebrew history for generations. As news of the prophet's apostasy spread beyond the immediate camp, it triggered a crisis that threatened to tear the Hebrew nation apart from within. But what the people didn't understand was that their leader's theological rebellion was only the first phase of a transformation so profound that it would fundamentally alter humanity's relationship with the divine realm forever. 3 months after the incident with the plague, Moses began experiencing visions that dwarfed anything he had encountered during his 40 days on Mount Sinai. These weren't communications from Yahweh alone, but direct transmissions from what the divine beings called the Cosmic Archive, a repository of universal knowledge that contained the complete history of divine mortal interactions across all of creation. Through these visions, Moses discovered that Earth was not unique in its spiritual evolution. Countless civilizations across the universe had faced the same transition from simple monotheistic faith to complex cosmic awareness that the Hebrews were now experiencing. Some had successfully navigated this evolution and achieved unprecedented levels of spiritual development. Others had been destroyed by the very knowledge that was meant to liberate them. "Your species stands at the threshold," Epidemic explained during one of these supernatural encounters. "The choice your people make in the coming weeks will determine whether humanity joins the cosmic community of enlightened beings or remains trapped in spiritual childhood for another 1,000 years." The weight of this revelation was crushing. Moses realized that his people weren't just struggling with a temporary crisis of faith. They were participating in a cosmic test that would determine the spiritual future of the entire human race. Every decision they made, every theological choice they embraced or rejected, would influence whether humanity was ready for the next stage of divine relationship. But the most devastating discovery came when Moses learned the true purpose behind the 40 years of wilderness wandering. The journey hadn't been punishment for the golden calf incident or preparation for conquering the promised land. Instead, it had been an elaborate spiritual quarantine designed to isolate the Hebrew people from other human populations, while their consciousness was gradually prepared for cosmic truth. Every generation that has died in the wilderness, Yahweh revealed in a moment of terrible honesty, was a necessary sacrifice. They carried theological programming that would have made the transition impossible. Only those born during the wandering, those whose consciousness developed within the liminal space between Egypt and Canaan, possess the spiritual flexibility required for what comes next. Moses finally understood why he had been forbidden from entering the promised land. It wasn't divine punishment for striking the rock in anger. It was cosmic necessity. His consciousness, shaped by decades of simple monotheistic faith, was fundamentally incompatible with the complex spiritual reality that awaited the Hebrew people in their new homeland. He was too deeply programmed with theological exclusivity to function effectively in a land where divine cooperation would be required for survival. The realization shattered something deep within Moses' soul. Everything he had suffered, the years in exile, the confrontation with Pharaoh, the burden of leadership, the constant rebellions of his people, had been preparation for a role he would never be allowed to complete. He was the bridge between old consciousness and new awareness, but bridges are meant to be crossed, not inhabited permanently. "Your sacrifice," Epidemic said with genuine compassion, "is the greatest ever demanded of a mortal being. You must die to the old spiritual paradigm so completely that you can never experience the new reality your suffering has made possible. You are the prophet of transition, forever caught between what was and what will be." But Moses' personal tragedy was only part of a larger cosmic drama that was unfolding. As his consciousness continued to expand through divine revelation, he began to perceive the true scope of the transformation his people would undergo once they entered the promised land. The territory they were destined to inhabit wasn't just geographically significant, it was a cosmic nexus where multiple dimensional realities intersected, requiring unprecedented levels of spiritual sophistication to navigate safely. The Canaanite peoples they were destined to encounter weren't merely human enemies to be conquered. Many of them were hybrid beings, the offspring of earlier divine mortal breeding experiments that had produced populations with natural psychic abilities and direct access to cosmic consciousness. The Hebrew conquest wouldn't be a simple military campaign. It would be a complex spiritual integration, requiring the Hebrew people to assimilate advanced consciousness technologies they had never encountered. "The wars you will fight," Thoth revealed, "are not between human armies, but between Different approaches to cosmic relationship. Your people's monotheistic training has given them unique spiritual strengths, but also critical vulnerabilities. They must learn to integrate multiple divine relationships without losing the focused devotion that makes them cosmically valuable. Moses began to understand that the Hebrew people were being groomed to serve as spiritual ambassadors between different levels of cosmic consciousness. Their experience with exclusive divine relationship had prepared them to maintain individual, spiritual integrity while engaging with complex metaphysical realities. They would become the bridge between simple human consciousness and advanced cosmic awareness. But achieving this transformation would require sacrifices that Moses found almost unbearable to contemplate. The generation that entered the Promised Land would need to abandon many of the theological certainties that had sustained them through the wilderness years. They would have to embrace spiritual practices that their current understanding would condemn as abominable. Most devastating of all, they would have to accept that their special relationship with Yahweh was not exclusive privilege, but cosmic responsibility. The divine beings began to show Moses visions of the future that awaited his people if they successfully navigated this transformation. He saw Hebrew communities that had achieved unprecedented levels of spiritual development, where direct divine communication was commonplace and miraculous abilities were considered normal aspects of human potential. He witnessed technological advances that resulted from integrating cosmic consciousness with material science, creating civilizations that surpassed anything currently existing on Earth. But he also saw the alternative futures that awaited if the transformation failed. Hebrew communities torn apart by theological conflicts they couldn't resolve, their people scattered across the earth as refugees from spiritual evolution they couldn't complete. Worse yet, he saw humanity itself trapped for millennia in primitive consciousness, unable to access the cosmic community that awaited them beyond the barriers of limited spiritual understanding. The choice approaches its final phase, Epidemic announced as the visions faded. Your people must decide within the next lunar cycle whether they will embrace cosmic complexity or retreat into theological simplicity. But understand, Moses, there is no middle ground. Evolution or extinction are the only options available. The pressure of this cosmic deadline began to manifest in increasingly dramatic ways throughout the Hebrew camp. Supernatural phenomena that required complex spiritual responses occurred daily, forcing the people to either develop new theological frameworks or face destruction from forces their current faith couldn't address. Some began to adapt, developing hybrid spiritual practices that honored both Hebrew traditions and cosmic realities. Others retreated deeper into orthodox exclusivity, viewing any deviation from pure monotheism as spiritual corruption. Moses found himself caught in the center of this theological hurricane, serving as the focal point for conflicts he could no longer resolve through traditional prophetic authority. His people looked to him for guidance, but the truth he carried would destroy the very faith that had sustained them through decades of hardship. The cosmic knowledge that had been forced upon him was both the key to their salvation and the instrument of their potential destruction. As the deadline approached, Moses began to prepare for his final prophetic act, one that would either launch humanity into its cosmic destiny or condemn it to spiritual stagnation for centuries to come. But the price of this ultimate revelation would be higher than anyone could have imagined. The decision that Moses was about to make would reshape the entire foundation of human spirituality and determine whether his people were ready to join the cosmic community of enlightened beings. But what he discovered about the true nature of the Promised Land would change everything once again. As the final lunar cycle began, Moses received the most devastating revelation of his entire prophetic career. The promised land that had sustained Hebrew hopes for generations was not simply a geographical territory flowing with milk and honey. It was a dimensional gateway, a cosmic intersection point where multiple realities converged and where the laws of physics themselves operated according to different principles than the rest of Earth. The divine beings had been preparing him for this ultimate truth gradually, but nothing could have readied Moses for the magnitude of what he was about to learn. In the vision that lasted 3 days and nights, during which his physical body remained motionless while his consciousness traveled through realms beyond mortal comprehension, Moses witnessed the true nature of the land his people were destined to inherit. What you have called the Promised Land, Apedimach revealed as they stood together on a spiritual mountaintop overlooking realities that existed beyond normal space-time, is actually a cosmic embassy. It serves as a meeting point between your dimensional plane and the higher realms, where advanced civilizations conduct the business of universal spiritual evolution. The implications were staggering. The Hebrew people weren't being led to a simple homeland where they could establish a conventional nation. They were being guided to a location where they would serve as Earth's representatives in a cosmic community that spanned galaxies and involved species whose consciousness operated at levels humanity could barely imagine. Through his expanded awareness, Moses began to perceive the infrastructure that had been carefully hidden from normal human perception. Beneath the physical landscape of Canaan lay a network of dimensional portals, cosmic communication arrays, and reality manipulation devices left by previous species who had achieved advanced spiritual evolution. The land itself was alive with energies that could either elevate human consciousness to unprecedented heights or completely destroy any population that attempted to occupy it without proper preparation. Every previous civilization that attempted to inhabit this territory, Thoth explained, faced the same choice your people now confront. They could evolve their consciousness to match the cosmic requirements of the location, or they would be consumed by energies they couldn't understand or control. Moses watched in horror as the divine being showed him the ruins of dozens of previous attempts. Beneath the familiar cities and landmarks of Canaan lay the remains of civilizations that had failed the cosmic test. Some had been destroyed by their own spiritual inadequacy, unable to adapt their consciousness to the dimensional requirements of the territory. Others had achieved partial success only to be consumed by cosmic energies they couldn't properly regulate. The Canaanites you see as enemies, Yahweh revealed with terrible gentleness, are actually the survivors of the most recent failed attempt. Their practices that you consider abominable are desperate efforts to maintain some level of cosmic connection without the spiritual framework necessary for true success. They are not your enemies, but your predecessors in this cosmic experiment. The revelation transformed Moses' entire understanding of the Hebrew mission. They weren't conquering a land populated by inferior peoples. They were being given the opportunity to succeed where others had failed, to become the first Earth civilization to successfully integrate with cosmic consciousness while maintaining their individual cultural identity. But success would require transformations that would make Moses' recent theological compromises seem trivial by comparison. The Hebrew people would need to develop psychic abilities that their current spiritual framework considered supernatural, engage in dimensional travel that defied their understanding of physical reality, and maintain conscious communication with non-human intelligences whose very existence challenged every assumption about divine uniqueness. Your monotheistic training, Apedimach explained, has actually prepared your people for this challenge in ways that previous civilizations lacked. Your focused devotion to a single divine source has created spiritual coherence that will allow you to engage with cosmic complexity without losing your essential identity. But this advantage comes with corresponding vulnerabilities that must be addressed before you can safely enter the dimensional nexus. The divine beings began to reveal the specific challenges that awaited the Hebrew people in their promised homeland. The land itself would test every individual's spiritual development, manifesting physical reality according to their level of consciousness. Those who maintained pure spiritual focus would find themselves living in paradise, while those whose consciousness remained conflicted would experience increasing difficulty until they either evolved or were forced to leave. Free will operates differently in dimensional nexus zones, Yahweh warned. Every thought, every emotion, every spiritual choice manifests immediately in physical reality. Your people must achieve unprecedented levels of mental discipline and spiritual coherence, or the very land will become uninhabitable for them. Moses began to understand why the 40 years of wilderness wandering had been necessary. The Hebrew people had needed to develop the spiritual foundations that would allow them to survive in a reality where consciousness directly shaped material experience. Every test they had faced, every rebellion they had survived, every moment of faith they had maintained had been preparation for inhabiting a land where spiritual law superseded physical law. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The very divine being showed Moses that the ultimate purpose of establishing a Hebrew nation in the cosmic nexus wasn't to create a powerful earthly kingdom. Instead, the Hebrews were being positioned to serve as Earth's ambassadors to a galactic confederation of spiritually advanced civilizations that had been observing human development for millennia. Your species has reached the point, Thoth revealed, where continued spiritual isolation is no longer possible. Either humanity joins the cosmic community as an equal partner, or it remains trapped in primitive consciousness until it destroys itself through spiritual immaturity. The Hebrew nation in the Promised Land would become humanity's first attempt at cosmic citizenship. Their success or failure would determine whether other human populations would be given similar opportunities, or whether the species would be left to develop without divine intervention until it either achieved cosmic consciousness independently or eliminated itself through spiritual inadequacy. Moses realized that every law he had given his people, every ritual he had established, every theological principle he had taught them had been designed to prepare them for this cosmic responsibility. The dietary restrictions would help them maintain the psychic sensitivity required for dimensional travel. The Sabbath observances would teach them the consciousness rhythms necessary for cosmic communication. Even the seemingly arbitrary ceremonial requirements would prove essential for functioning in reality zones where spiritual law determined physical possibility. But achieving this transformation would require sacrifices that Moses found almost impossible to contemplate. The Hebrew people would need to abandon their conception of themselves as a chosen people separate from others and embrace their role as representatives of all humanity. They would have to develop relationships with non-human intelligences that would challenge every assumption about divine uniqueness and mortal limitation. Most devastating of all, they would have to accept that their covenant with Yahweh was not an exclusive divine relationship, but a training program designed to prepare them for cosmic responsibilities that would eventually require them to serve as bridges between Earth consciousness and galactic awareness. The choice before your people, Apetamak announced as the cosmic vision began to fade, is no longer between different forms of human spirituality. It is between remaining human as they currently understand the term or evolving into something unprecedented in Earth's history. As Moses' consciousness returned to the limitations of mortal awareness, he found himself facing the most impossible decision of his entire prophetic career. His people expected him to lead them into a promised land where they could establish a conventional nation based on the spiritual principles he had taught them. But the reality awaiting them would require them to transcend every limitation that currently defined human existence. The cosmic deadline was approaching, and Moses knew that the choice he made in the next few days would determine not just the fate of the Hebrew people, but the spiritual future of the entire human species. But Moses had yet to learn the most shocking truth of all, the real reason why he had been chosen for this mission and what his ultimate sacrifice would mean for the cosmic transformation that was about to unfold. Topic 07. The ultimate sacrifice that transformed reality itself. The final revelation came to Moses in the form of a cosmic memory that had been buried within his consciousness since birth, waiting for the moment when his spiritual development would be sufficient to contain its devastating truth. As the deadline for humanity's cosmic choice approached its final hours, the divine beings removed the last barriers that had protected Moses from understanding his true nature and ultimate purpose in the cosmic plan. What he discovered would explain every mystery of his extraordinary life and reveal why his sacrifice was essential for humanity's spiritual evolution. Moses was not simply a human prophet who had been chosen to lead his people. He was a hybrid consciousness, a being whose very existence bridged multiple dimensional realities and whose death would serve as the catalyst for humanity's transformation into cosmic citizenship. Your birth was no accident, Apedimach revealed as they stood together in a realm beyond physical space and time. Your mother's encounter with divine forces during her pregnancy was not metaphorical inspiration, but literal genetic modification. You carry within your consciousness the accumulated spiritual wisdom of every civilization that has successfully made the transition to cosmic awareness. The implications shattered Moses' understanding of his own identity. Every supernatural ability he had manifested, every divine encounter he had experienced, every moment of prophetic insight had resulted from the hybrid nature of his consciousness. He was simultaneously human and cosmic, mortal and eternal, individual and collective. His very existence served as proof that the barrier between human and divine consciousness could be transcended. But this revelation came with a price that made all his previous sacrifices seem insignificant. The cosmic transformation awaiting humanity required the complete dissolution of Moses' hybrid consciousness back into the universal field from which it had been assembled. His death would not be a simple cessation of mortal life, but a cosmic unraveling that would release the accumulated spiritual wisdom of countless civilizations directly into human consciousness. Your people will not simply inherit the promised land, Yahweh explained, with infinite tenderness and terrible inevitability. They will inherit the cosmic awareness that has been stored within your consciousness throughout your entire lifetime. But this inheritance can only be transferred through the complete sacrifice of your individual existence. Moses began to understand the true meaning of every cryptic prophecy he had received about his fate. When he had been told he would not enter the promised land, it was not divine punishment but cosmic necessity. His consciousness was too valuable to risk in the transformation process. It needed to be preserved until the moment when its sacrifice could catalyze humanity's evolution. The divine beings revealed the mechanics of what would occur when Moses died. His consciousness would explode outward like a spiritual supernova, seeding human awareness with cosmic knowledge that had taken other civilizations millennia to develop. Every Hebrew who entered the Promised Land would carry within their minds fragments of cosmic wisdom that would gradually unfold over generations, creating a population capable of functioning as Earth's representatives in the galactic community. But the transformation will not be limited to your people alone. Thoth revealed, showing Moses visions of the future that stretched across centuries. The cosmic consciousness released by your sacrifice will gradually permeate all human populations, creating evolutionary pressure that will eventually elevate the entire species. Your death becomes the seed of humanity's cosmic rebirth. Through these visions, Moses witnessed the long-term consequences of his sacrifice rippling through human history. He saw Hebrew communities that had achieved unprecedented levels of spiritual development, their consciousness enhanced by cosmic wisdom they didn't fully understand but could instinctively access. He watched as this enhanced awareness gradually spread to other populations through intermarriage, trade relationships, and simple proximity to those who carried fragments of cosmic consciousness. But he also saw the struggles that this transformation would create. Human societies that were not prepared for cosmic awareness would experience the enhanced consciousness as madness, persecution, or divine possession. The very gift that would eventually elevate humanity would initially create division, conflict, and suffering as different populations adapted to cosmic consciousness at different rates. The process cannot be rushed, Epidemic warned, showing Moses the catastrophic consequences that would result from attempting to force cosmic awareness onto unprepared populations. Your sacrifice provides the seed, but each human community must develop cosmic consciousness at its own pace, according to its own spiritual capacity. Moses realized that his people's experience in the Promised Land would serve as a crucial experiment in human cosmic development. Their success or failure would determine how the cosmic consciousness released by his death would be distributed to other human populations. If they successfully integrated enhanced awareness with their cultural identity, similar opportunities would be offered to other groups. If they failed, the cosmic consciousness would remain dormant within human genetics for centuries until a more suitable opportunity arose. The weight of this responsibility was almost unbearable. Moses understood that his death would not end his involvement in human spiritual evolution, but transform it into something far more complex and demanding. His consciousness would become permanently woven into the fabric of human awareness, guiding and protecting the species through its transition to cosmic citizenship, while remaining forever separated from individual existence. You will become the guardian spirit of human cosmic evolution, Yahweh revealed, present in every moment of spiritual breakthrough, every instance of divine inspiration, every achievement of enhanced consciousness. But you will never again experience individual identity or personal relationship. As the cosmic deadline reached its final moments, Moses made his ultimate choice with the same courage that had sustained him through every previous crisis. Standing on Mount Nebo, gazing toward the Promised Land that his people would inherit but that he would never physically enter, Moses consciously released his attachment to individual existence and surrendered his hybrid consciousness to serve humanity's cosmic transformation. The moment of his death was unlike anything recorded in human spiritual experience. Witnesses described light that transcended normal perception, sound that spoke directly to the soul rather than the ears, and energy that transformed the very atomic structure of everything within miles of the location. But more importantly, every Hebrew who would enter the Promised Land suddenly found their consciousness expanded with knowledge and abilities they had never possessed. The transformation was immediately apparent. Hebrew children began demonstrating psychic abilities that allowed them to perceive dimensional realities previously invisible to human awareness. Adults discovered they could communicate directly with cosmic intelligences and access information from sources beyond earthly knowledge. The entire population developed an intuitive understanding of spiritual technologies that would allow them to function effectively in the cosmic nexus they were about to inhabit. But Moses' sacrifice created consequences that extended far beyond the Hebrew people. The cosmic consciousness released by his death began to influence human development across all populations, creating evolutionary pressure that would gradually elevate the entire species over the course of millennia. Every major spiritual breakthrough in human history, every instance of enhanced awareness, every achievement of cosmic understanding would draw upon the reservoir of wisdom that Moses had released through his ultimate sacrifice. The most remarkable consequence was the creation of what cosmic civilizations called a species bridge, a permanent connection between human consciousness and galactic awareness that would allow humanity to gradually develop cosmic citizenship without losing its essential cultural identity. Other species had achieved cosmic consciousness by abandoning their original nature, but humans would become the first to maintain individual and cultural diversity while participating in universal spiritual community. The legacy of Moses's cosmic sacrifice would unfold over thousands of years as human consciousness slowly accessed the cosmic wisdom embedded within its genetic and spiritual structure. The Hebrew experience in the Promised Land would serve as the prototype for humanity's eventual cosmic integration, while the consciousness released by Moses' death would provide the spiritual foundation that would eventually allow the entire species to join the galactic community as equal partners rather than dependent clients. In the end, Moses' greatest humiliation, his encounter with the African deity who revealed the limitations of his theological understanding, had led to his ultimate triumph. By embracing cosmic complexity rather than clinging to spiritual simplicity, he had made possible humanity's transformation from isolated planetary consciousness to active participation in universal spiritual evolution. The secret that religious authorities had hidden for millennia was not Moses' defeat, but his victory, a sacrifice so profound that it had literally rewritten the spiritual DNA of the human species and opened pathways to cosmic consciousness that would continue to unfold for thousands of years to come. And somewhere in the cosmic realms, beyond mortal perception, the consciousness that had once been Moses continued its work as humanity's guardian guide, ensuring that the species he had died to transform would successfully navigate its journey toward cosmic citizenship and take its rightful place among the enlightened civilizations of the universe. The story of Moses' cosmic sacrifice reveals why humanity possesses unique spiritual potential and explains the hidden forces that continue to guide our species toward its ultimate cosmic destiny. His humiliation became humanity's greatest gift, the bridge between earthly consciousness and galactic awareness that will eventually transform our entire civilization.